Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as burdens nobody else wants. At that moment, when hope feels as distant as tomorrow's sunrise, life has a way of placing exactly what we need right in front of us. At the dusty county livestock auction in Cedar Falls, nobody gave the old grey donkey a second look. Jake Morrison sat in the back row with $20 to his name, hoping to find something to keep his ranch alive for his daughter. When the auctioneer couldn't get a single bid on the tired old donkey, Jake raised his hand. His neighbors shook their heads. His wallet was nearly empty. But sometimes a father's heart knows things his mind doesn't understand. That $20 decision would soon make Jake Morrison a millionaire. What could an old donkey possibly do that would change everything for this struggling family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison had never imagined his life would come to this, sitting in a dusty livestock auction with 20 crumpled bills in his wallet, searching for miracles in the form of used farm equipment. The morning sun cast long shadows through the auction barn's weathered windows, illuminating particles of hay dust that danced in the air like tiny golden memories of better times. 3 years ago, he'd been a different man. Sarah, his wife, his anchor, his everything had been alive then, filling their ranch house with laughter and the smell of fresh-baked bread. Emma had been only 5, small enough to ride on his shoulders as they walked the fence lines together, her tiny hands pointing out every wildflower and butterfly. The Morrison ranch had been thriving, cattle grazing in green pastures, the old red barn standing proud against the Montana sky. But cancer doesn't care about dreams or family legacies. Sarah's battle had been fierce but brief, lasting only 8 months from diagnosis to that terrible morning when Jake woke to silence instead of her gentle breathing. The medical bills had eaten through their savings like wildfire through dry grass. The ranch, passed down through 3 generations of Morrisons, now felt more like a millstone around his neck than a blessing. Emma had taken her mother's death with a resilience that both amazed and worried Jake. At 8 years old, she possessed a wisdom that seemed borrowed from someone much older. She still asked about Mama sometimes, usually at bedtime when the house felt too quiet. Jake would sit on the edge of her bed, running his fingers through her dark hair so much like Sarah's, and tell her stories about heaven having the most beautiful gardens, where Mama could watch over them always. "Daddy," she'd said just last week, her serious brown eyes studying his face, "are we going to lose the ranch?" The question had hit him like a physical blow. He tried to shield her from the worst of their financial troubles, but children see everything, understand more than adults give them credit for. "We're going to be just fine, sweetheart," he'd whispered, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. But fine seemed like a distant dream now. The stack of overdue notices on his kitchen table grew thicker each week. The bank manager, Harold Crenshaw, had been understanding. At first he'd known Jake's father, had attended Sarah's funeral, had shaken Jake's hand with genuine sympathy. But sympathy doesn't pay mortgages, and Harold's calls had become more frequent, his tone more businesslike. The ranch itself was falling apart in ways that broke Jake's heart daily. The barn's roof leaked in 3 places now, forcing him to move equipment around every time it rained. 2 sections of fencing had collapsed last month, and he'd had to sell his remaining cattle earlier than planned just to patch them with second-hand materials. The old red pickup truck he'd inherited from his father needed new brakes, a transmission service, and probably divine intervention to make it through another Montana winter. Old Pete Hutchinson, their nearest neighbor, had been dropping by more often lately, always with some excuse, returning a borrowed tool, checking on a mutual fence line, bringing Emma a small bag of penny candy from town. Pete was 73 and had never married, living alone on his smaller spread with just a couple of horses and a vegetable garden that was the envy of the county. Jake suspected the old man saw too much of his younger self in their situation. "You know, Jake," Pete had said yesterday while they fixed a gate together. There ain't no shame in accepting help when you need it. Your daddy would have done the same for anyone in these parts. But Jake's pride, that stubborn Morrison pride his father had warned him about, made accepting charity feel like failure. This ranch was his heritage, Emma's inheritance. 3 generations of his family had worked this land, built their lives here, raised their children in the shadow of the Rockies. How could he be the one to lose it all? Emma's teacher, Sarah Fletcher, had been another source of quiet support since Sarah's passing. Not Sarah, his wife, that would have been too much for his heart to handle, but Sarah Fletcher, who taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary and had a gentle way of checking on Emma's emotional well-being. She was perhaps 35, with kind eyes and practical hands that always seemed to be creating something beautiful for her students. Emma talks about the ranch constantly, Miss Fletcher had told him during their last parent conference. She draws pictures of it, writes stories about the animals you used to have. That place means the world to her, Mr. Morrison. Jake knew that. He saw it in the way Emma would run to the fence line every morning, pretending they still had horses in the pasture. He heard it in her voice when she talked about the baby calves they used to raise, or the way her mother had taught her to collect eggs from the chickens they could no longer afford to keep. Emma's dreams were built on the foundation of that ranch, and Jake felt the weight of those dreams pressing down on his shoulders every single day. The morning of the auction had started like any other. Emma had eaten her cereal while sketching horses in the margins of her school notebook, chattering about a story she was writing about a magical farm where all the animals could talk. Jake had kissed her forehead and watched her climb onto the school bus, her backpack bouncing with each step, her lunch money counted out in quarters and dimes from the jar Sarah used to keep for emergencies. That jar was empty now, like so many other things in their lives. The auction represented his last hope for finding affordable equipment. Maybe a used cultivator, some fence posts, anything that could help him squeeze a little more life from the ranch. $20 wouldn't buy much, but it might buy enough time to figure out what came next. As Jake sat in that auction barn, surrounded by ranchers who knew his story, he felt the weight of their sympathetic glances. Some of these men had offered him workday labor, seasonal help, anything to keep him afloat. But taking a job meant less time on the ranch, less time with Emma, and the acknowledgement that he was no longer a rancher but just another man working for someone else. The auctioneer's voice droned on, calling out lot numbers and descriptions. Jake watched a decent-looking cultivator sell for $300, 15 times what he had to spend. A set of fence stretchers went for $85. Even the broken-down equipment commanded more than his meager budget allowed. That's when they brought out the donkey. The gray animal looked as worn down as Jake felt. His coat was patchy and dull, his ribs visible beneath loose skin that spoke of too many missed meals. But it was the donkey's eyes that caught Jake's attention, dark and intelligent, holding a sadness that seemed all too familiar. This was an animal that had known better days, had perhaps once been loved and cared for by someone who was no longer there. The auctioneer didn't even try to drum up enthusiasm. Lot 47, one grey gelding donkey, approximately 12 years old, looking for opening bids at $50. Silence filled the barn. $40 then. Anyone give me 40? More silence. Men shifted in their seats, looked at their boots, checked their watches. $25. Come on, folks. This animal's got good bones. Jake found himself studying the donkey more closely. Despite his poor condition, there was something dignified about the way he stood, patient and calm, while strangers decided his fate. Emma would love him, Jake thought suddenly. She'd always had a soft spot for animals that needed help, just like her mother had. $20. I'll take $20 to get us moving. Jake's hand rose before his brain could stop it. The auctioneer looked almost surprised. I've got $20. Do I hear 25? The barn remained silent except for the shuffling of feet and the distant lowing of cattle in the holding pens. Fair warning at $20. The gavel rose. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $20. Pete Hutchinson, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned and gave Jake a look that was equal parts bewildered and concerned. Jake's stomach dropped as he realized what he'd just done. $20, his entire budget spent on an animal he had no way to properly feed or care for. An animal that would add to his expenses rather than solve any of his problems. But as he stood to claim his purchase, something in the donkey's eyes seemed to shift. A spark of recognition, perhaps even gratitude. And Jake Morrison, struggling single father and failing rancher, found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd made the first good decision in a very long time. The paperwork was simple. The donkey's name was listed as Buster, and his previous owner had been an elderly woman from 3 counties over who'd passed away the previous month. Her family just wanted him gone, settled somewhere he'd be cared for. Jake signed the forms with a mixture of dread and anticipation, his $20 officially making him the owner of one tired, hungry donkey. As he walked toward the holding pen to collect Buster, Jake caught sight of Emma's school photo, tucked into his wallet, where his money used to be. Her smile beamed up at him bright, trusting, full of faith that her daddy could handle anything the world threw at them. That smile was worth more than all the practical farm equipment in the world, and maybe, just maybe, it was worth one lonely donkey who needed a second chance at happiness, just like they did. The drive home from the auction felt longer than usual, with Buster standing quietly in the back of Jake's beat-up trailer. Every few minutes, Jake caught glimpses of the donkey in his rearview mirror, still as a statue, those intelligent dark eyes taking in the passing landscape. What had he done? $20 might not seem like much to most people, but it represented his entire budget, and now he had another mouth to feed with money he didn't have. The Morrison ranch came into view as they crested the familiar hill, and Jake felt his usual mixture of pride and heartbreak. The weathered barn stood like a monument to better times, its red paint faded but still dignified against the backdrop of rolling pastures. The house, a 2-story farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1952, needed a new roof and fresh paint, but it was home. It was Emma's legacy, and Jake was determined to preserve it somehow. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, Emma burst through the front door like a bottle rocket. School had ended an hour ago, and she'd been watching for his return from the kitchen window, where she did her homework each afternoon. Her dark hair streamed behind her as she ran toward the truck, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. "Daddy, did you find anything good at the auction?" she called out, her 8-year-old enthusiasm infectious despite everything. Jake climbed out of the cab slowly, steeling himself for her reaction. "Well, sweetheart, I found something. Not exactly what I was looking for, but something that might need us as much as we need it." Emma's eyes widened as she spotted Buster in the trailer. "Oh my goodness. Daddy, is that a donkey? Is he ours?" The pure joy in her voice made Jake's heart clench. This was exactly what he'd hoped for and feared. Emma had inherited her mother's tender heart when it came to animals. During better times, the ranch had been home to horses, cattle, chickens, and even a family of barn cats. Now, their only companions were the memories echoing in empty stalls. "His name is Buster," Jake said, lowering the trailer's gate. "He's been having a hard time lately, kind of like us. I thought maybe we could help each other out." Buster stepped down from the trailer with careful dignity, his hooves making soft clopping sounds on the gravel. Up close, his condition looked even worse than it had at the auction. His grey coat was patchy and dull, missing hair in several spots that suggested poor nutrition or neglect. His ribs were visible beneath loose skin, and when he lifted his head to survey his new surroundings, Jake could see how thin his neck had become. But Emma saw none of that. She saw only a gentle animal who needed love, and she approached him with the fearless compassion that had always amazed Jake. "Hello, Buster," she whispered, extending her small hand palm up. "I'm Emma. This is going to be your home now." Buster lowered his head and sniffed her hand, then allowed her to stroke his nose. His ears, which had been pinned back with wariness, relaxed forward. For the first time since Jake had seen him at the auction, the donkey's expression softened. "He likes me, Daddy," Emma exclaimed. "Look, he's smiling." Jake had to admit that Buster did look more content than he had an hour ago. Maybe animals could sense kindness the way Emma seemed to sense their need for it. As he led Buster toward the old barn, Jake found himself remembering Sarah's words about Emma having a gift with creatures that needed healing. The barn felt cavernous, with only one occupant. Jake settled Buster into the largest stall, the one that had once housed Thunder, Sarah's favorite mare. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd had to sell Thunder 2 years ago to pay for Sarah's treatments, and now here was another four-legged friend taking his place. The donkey's worn leather halter was cracked and frayed, held together in places with baling wire and good intentions. It told a story of hard use and little care, of an animal who'd been forgotten by the world until today. Jake made a mental note to add new halter to his growing list of expenses he couldn't afford. "He's so skinny, Daddy," Emma observed, running her hand along Buster's neck. "Can we get him some food?" Jake nodded, though his stomach knotted at the thought of feed costs. "We'll take good care of him, Em. That's what we do here. We take care of family." That evening, after a dinner of canned soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, one of the few meals Jake had mastered since becoming a single father, Emma insisted on visiting Buster before bedtime. Jake watched from the barn doorway as his daughter sat on an overturned bucket, talking to the donkey about her day at school, her plans for summer vacation, and her memories of her mother. "Mama used to sing to all our animals," Emma told Buster, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "She said music made everything better, even when you were sad or scared." As if to test that theory, Emma began humming a lullaby that Sarah used to sing, something about moonbeams and starlight and dreams coming true. Jake felt his throat tighten with familiar grief. But then something extraordinary happened. Buster lifted his head and made a sound that wasn't quite a bray, wasn't quite a whinny, but something in between. It was musical, almost melodic, as if he were trying to harmonize with Emma's humming. The little girl stopped mid-note, her eyes wide with wonder. "Did you hear that, Daddy? He was singing with me." Jake stepped closer, certain his ears had been playing tricks on him. "Try it again, sweetheart." Emma resumed her humming, and once again Buster responded with that strange, musical sound. This time, Jake was close enough to see the donkey's expression peaceful, almost blissful, as if the music transported him somewhere far from his current circumstances. "I've never heard anything like that," Jake murmured, more to himself than to Emma. "He's special, isn't he, Daddy?" Emma said, reaching up to scratch behind Buster's ears. "I knew it the minute I saw him. He's going to help us, just like we're going to help him." As they walked back to the house under a canopy of stars, Jake found himself thinking about Emma's words. Help them? How? He was barely keeping their heads above water as it was, and now he had another responsibility, another expense. But there had been something almost magical about that moment in the barn, the way Buster had responded to Emma's lullaby, the peaceful expression on both their faces. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jake sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, researching donkey care and feeding requirements. The information was sobering: proper hay, grain, regular veterinary care, hoof trimming, dental work. The costs added up quickly, far beyond what his strained budget could handle. But as he closed the laptop and prepared for bed, Jake couldn't shake the memory of that musical sound Buster had made. It wasn't like any animal noise he'd ever heard. There had been something almost intentional about it, as if the donkey understood the melody and was genuinely trying to participate. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe Buster was special. And maybe, just maybe, Jake's impulsive $20 decision would prove to be the smartest thing he'd done in a very long time. Outside, the night wind rustled through the cottonwoods that lined the drive, carrying with it the sounds of a ranch settling into sleep. In the barn, Buster stood quietly in his stall, his ears pricked forward as if listening to music only he could hear. For the first time in months, he had a full belly, a clean bed of straw, and the memory of a little girl's lullaby to keep him company. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries about money and the future. But tonight, Jake Morrison fell asleep with something he hadn't felt in a long time, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, against all odds, things might actually work out after all. Jake woke before dawn, a habit that had served him well during 30 years of ranch life. The house was still and quiet, Emma sleeping soundly in her room down the hall. As he pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his first thought was of Buster. How had the donkey's first night gone? Was he settling in, or would Jake find an animal made miserable by unfamiliar surroundings? The walk to the barn revealed his answer before he even opened the door. Instead of the restless pacing or calling he might have expected from a displaced animal, Jake heard something that stopped him in his tracks, a low, melodic humming coming from inside the barn. When he pushed open the heavy door, he found Buster standing calmly in his stall, making that same musical sound he'd produced the night before. But this time, there was no Emma humming along, no external music to inspire the performance. The donkey was simply standing there, creating his own gentle melody in the grey pre-dawn light. "Well, I'll be," Jake murmured, approaching the stall slowly. "Good morning to you too, Buster." The donkey turned his head toward Jake, and those intelligent dark eyes seemed brighter today, less clouded with the despair that had marked his face at the auction. When Jake reached out to pat his neck, Buster leaned into the touch, a small gesture that spoke volumes about trust beginning to form. After feeding Buster with hay he'd bought on credit from Pete Hutchinson, Jake spent his morning researching donkey care with the dedication of a man preparing for final exams. The internet was full of information, most of it confirming his fears about the costs involved. Proper nutrition for a malnourished donkey required high-quality hay, supplements, and grain expenses that would strain his already breaking budget. But Jake Morrison had never been one to do things halfway. If he was going to care for this animal, he was going to do it right. He made a list of necessities and drove to the feed store in town, his credit card weighing heavy in his wallet. The bill came to $87, more than 4 times what he'd paid for Buster himself. When Emma came home from school that afternoon, she made a beeline for the barn with the single-minded purpose of a child with a new best friend. Jake followed, curious to see how the second meeting would go. Would yesterday's magic repeat itself, or had it been a fluke brought on by exhaustion and wishful thinking? Emma had come prepared. In her small hands, she carried a piece of poster board and a set of markers she'd borrowed from her art supplies. "I made something for Buster," she announced, setting her materials down outside his stall. Jake watched as his daughter carefully drew letters across the poster board. Buster's stage, in bright red marker, decorated with musical notes and stars. It was the kind of project that would have made Sarah smile. Emma had inherited her mother's artistic eye and her flair for making ordinary things special. "A stage?" Jake asked. "What kind of stage?" "For when he sings," Emma explained matter-of-factly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Every performer needs a proper stage." She hung the sign on the stall door with pieces of tape, then stepped back to admire her work. Buster watched the entire process with what Jake could only describe as interest, his ears forward, his head tilted slightly, as if he understood exactly what was happening. "Okay, Buster," Emma said, settling herself on the same overturned bucket she'd used the night before. "Let's practice." She began humming the same lullaby as before, and within moments, Buster joined in with his remarkable musical braying. But this time, Jake noticed something different. The donkey's timing was better, more in sync with Emma's melody. It was as if he'd been thinking about it, working on it in the quiet hours of the morning. "He's getting better at it," Emma observed, stopping mid-song. "Listen, Daddy, he's learning the tune." Jake had to admit she was right. What had seemed like coincidence the night before now appeared to be genuine musical ability. Buster, wasn't just making noise in response to Emma's humming. He was actively participating in creating music. Over the next few days, Jake watched this unlikely partnership develop with growing amazement. Emma would rush to the barn each afternoon, eager to continue what she'd started calling music lessons. Buster, for his part, seemed to look forward to these sessions as much as she did. His ears would perk up the moment he heard her footsteps, and he'd position himself near the front of his stall, ready to perform. The improvement in Buster's physical condition was remarkable. The high-quality feed Jake had invested in was already showing results. The donkey's coat was beginning to fill out, his ribs becoming less prominent. But it was the change in his demeanor that truly impressed Jake. The sad, defeated animal from the auction had been replaced by one who showed genuine enthusiasm for his daily routine. Sarah Fletcher noticed the change in Emma too when she stopped by Friday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off some worksheets Emma had missed during a doctor's appointment. Jake suspected the real reason for her visit was to check on how they were adjusting to life with their new four-legged family member. "Emma's been talking about Buster non-stop," Sarah told Jake as they watched Emma demonstrate Buster's abilities. "The other children are fascinated by her stories about a singing donkey." Jake felt a familiar pang of embarrassment. "I hope she's not disrupting class with—" "Not at all," Sarah assured him. "If anything, it's brought out a side of her I haven't seen since her mother passed. She's more animated, more engaged. Whatever you're doing here, it's working." As if to prove her point, Emma's laughter rang out from the barn, followed immediately by Buster's musical response. The sound made both adults smile. There was something infectious about pure joy, especially when it came from a child who'd had too little reason for happiness lately. "He really is musical, isn't he?" Sarah observed, moving closer to the stall. "I've never heard anything like it." "Neither have I," Jake admitted. "I keep thinking I should record it or something, just to prove it's real." Sarah turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know, that's not a bad idea. Emma's been working on a project about unique animals for her presentation next week. Maybe she could include Buster." The suggestion planted a seed in Jake's mind. That evening, after Emma was asleep, he found himself digging through a closet until he located his old smartphone, a device he'd barely used since Sarah's death. Most of his contacts were outdated, his social media accounts dormant, but the camera still worked. Maybe it was time to start documenting this strange new chapter in their lives. Maybe Emma was right about Buster being special. And maybe, just maybe, the world needed to know about a little girl and her singing donkey who had found each other when they both needed hope the most. Standing in the barn that night, watching Buster contentedly munch his evening hay, Jake Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement about tomorrow. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking forward to what came next, instead of simply enduring it. The homemade Buster's stage sign fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, coming through the barn door, and Jake found himself wondering if Emma's innocent optimism might be more prophetic than either of them realized. Saturday morning brought the first real test of Jake's resolve to document Buster's unusual talent. Emma had convinced him to bring the phone to the barn during their morning routine, chattering excitedly about showing her classmates proof of Buster's abilities. "Make sure you get his face when he sings, Daddy," Emma instructed, settling onto her usual bucket. "Mrs. Fletcher says facial expressions are important in performances." Jake fumbled with the phone's camera function, embarrassed by how unfamiliar the technology felt in his hands. Sarah had always been the one to capture family moments. She'd had an eye for photography that Jake had never developed. But as Emma began her familiar lullaby and Buster joined in with his melodic response, Jake found himself holding his breath as the camera recorded. The video was less than 2 minutes long, but those 2 minutes captured something extraordinary. Buster's timing had improved dramatically over the past week. He no longer simply responded to Emma's humming. He seemed to anticipate the melody, coming in at precisely the right moments, even harmonizing in a way that suggested genuine musical understanding. Play it back, Emma demanded the moment Jake stopped recording. As they huddled around the small screen, watching themselves perform with Buster, Jake felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. Even seeing it with his own eyes, recorded on digital video, it seemed almost too remarkable to be real. Here was his 8-year-old daughter and a $20 donkey, creating something that sounded like it belonged in a professional recording studio. "We have to show Mrs. Fletcher," Emma exclaimed, "and Miss Sarah, and Pete, and everyone." Jake's instinct was to hesitate. The Morrison family had always been private people, not given to seeking attention or making spectacles of themselves. But looking at Emma's radiant face, seeing the pure joy this brought her, he found it impossible to say no. Sarah Fletcher's reaction when they showed her the video Monday afternoon was everything Emma had hoped for, and more. The teacher watched the recording 3 times, her expression growing more amazed with each viewing. "This is incredible," she murmured, handing the phone back to Jake. "I mean, I heard him myself, but seeing it like this. Emma, your presentation is going to be the hit of the class." "Do you think other people would want to see it?" Emma asked, bouncing slightly on her toes. "Like people who don't know us?" Sarah looked thoughtfully at Jake. "Have you considered sharing this online? I know it might seem daunting, but there are people all over the world who would be amazed by this." Jake's immediate response was skepticism. "I don't know anything about that stuff. Social media, internet videos. That's not really my world. It doesn't have to be complicated," Sarah assured him. "Sometimes the simplest things touch people the most. A little girl and her donkey making beautiful music together, that's the kind of story that gives people hope." That evening, Jake found himself at the kitchen table with his laptop, staring at a screen that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Emma sat beside him, offering encouragement and advice with the confidence of a generation that had grown up with technology. "You just click there, Daddy," she pointed to the upload button. "Mrs. Fletcher showed me at school today." "Are you sure about this, Em?" Jake asked. "Once it's out there, we can't take it back." Emma looked at him with the same serious expression she'd inherited from her mother. "Mama always said that when you have something beautiful, you should share it. Buster's singing is beautiful. Maybe it will make other people happy too." The upload process was surprisingly simple. Jake created an account with a username suggested by Emma and Buster Sing. The video title was equally straightforward. 8-year-old girl and her rescue donkey make beautiful music together. Jake typed a brief description. "Our donkey Buster came to us from a livestock auction. He was skinny and sad, but my daughter Emma saw something special in him. This is what happens when they sing together." He hesitated over the publish button for a long moment, his finger hovering over the mouse. Once he clicked it, their private moment would become public property. Their quiet life on the ranch would be open to the judgment and commentary of strangers. But Emma's small hand covered his, and together they clicked publish. "How long does it take?" Emma asked, staring at the screen as if expecting immediate results. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe nobody will even see it." They were both wrong about that. Jake woke the next morning to his phone, buzzing with notifications he didn't understand. The video had been viewed 847 times overnight. By the time Emma came home from school, that number had climbed to over 30. By bedtime, it was approaching 10. "Daddy, look at all these comments," Emma exclaimed, scrolling through responses that ranged from heart emojis to lengthy paragraphs about the beauty of the performance. One comment particularly caught Jake's attention. "This brought tears to my eyes. Lost my husband last year and have been struggling to find joy in anything. Your daughter and Buster reminded me that beautiful moments still exist. Thank you for sharing this gift." Another read, "I'm a music teacher, and I've never heard anything like this. That donkey has genuine musical ability. You should contact the local news. People need to see this." The local news suggestion was repeated dozens of times in the comments, along with tags for various media outlets and suggestions for talk show appearances. Jake felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but Emma was thriving in it. "We're famous, Daddy," she announced. "People all over the world know about Buster." Over the next few days, the views continued to climb exponentially. 50, 0, then 100, 0, then 250, 0. Jake's phone rang constantly, with numbers he didn't recognize. Journalists, producers, people claiming to represent various media outlets. He ignored most of them, unsure how to navigate this sudden intrusion into their quiet life. But when Harold Crenshaw from the bank called, Jake answered immediately, fearing another demand for payment. "Jake." Harold's voice was warmer than it had been in months. "I just wanted to call and tell you how proud our whole community is of what you and Emma have accomplished. That video has been shared more times than I can count. You've put Cedar Falls on the map." "It's just a donkey singing, Harold," Jake said, though he was beginning to realize it was much more than that. "It's hope, Jake. It's a reminder that good things can happen to good people." And speaking of good things, I had a call this morning from someone at Petco Corporate. They want to discuss a potential sponsorship opportunity. Jake nearly dropped the phone. "Sponsorship? Apparently, your video has caught the attention of some very important people in the pet industry. They want to talk about featuring Buster in their advertising campaigns. Jake, this could change everything for you and Emma." As Jake hung up the phone, he looked at the screenshot Emma had printed and taped to the refrigerator, the video frozen at the moment when both she and Buster had their faces lifted toward the sky, lost in their shared song. In the bottom corner, the view counter showed 287, 423, and climbing. Maybe Emma had been right about Buster being special. Maybe this $20 donkey really was going to help them after all. The Petco representative arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt more like a dream than reality. Margaret Chen stepped out of a sleek rental car wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Jake's monthly grocery budget, but her smile was genuine and her handshake firm. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I've watched your video about 40 times in the past week. Every time, it gives me chills. What you and Emma have created with Buster is exactly the kind of authentic story our company wants to support." Jake led her toward the barn, still struggling to believe this was happening. The contract Margaret had mentioned on the phone included numbers that seemed impossible, a 5-figure sponsorship deal in exchange for featuring Buster in Petco's upcoming campaign about rescue animals finding loving homes. Emma had stayed home from school for the meeting, barely able to contain her excitement. She'd spent the morning grooming Buster until his coat shone, braiding small ribbons into his mane and practicing their routine. The Buster's stage sign had been reinforced with additional tape and decorated with fresh drawings of musical notes. "This is Buster," Emma announced formally as they entered the barn. "He used to be sad, but now he's a star." Margaret knelt to Emma's eye level, her professional demeanor softening. "I can see why he's special. But before we talk business, could I hear him sing? I know it sounds strange, but after seeing that video, I need to experience it in person." What followed was perhaps Buster's finest performance to date. As Emma began her lullaby, the donkey seemed to sense the importance of the moment. His musical response was more nuanced than ever, with variations in tone and timing that suggested he'd been practicing. Margaret listened with her mouth slightly open, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "In 20 years of marketing, I've never seen anything like this," she said when the song ended. "This isn't just a trick or a trained response. This animal is genuinely musical." The contract Margaret presented was written in language that Jake struggled to understand. But the bottom line was clear. Petco wanted to feature Buster in a national advertising campaign, with Jake and Emma receiving 25-0 upfront and royalties based on the campaign's success. There would be photo shoots, possibly television commercials, and guaranteed exposure to millions of potential viewers. "I need to think about this," Jake said, his practical nature warring with his desperate financial situation. "This is all happening so fast." "Of course," Margaret agreed. "But I should mention that we're not the only company interested. I've heard rumors that Purina and Blue Buffalo are also considering outreach. The pet industry is very competitive, and authentic stories like yours don't come along often." That evening, Jake sat at the kitchen table with the contract spread before him, trying to make sense of clauses and sub-clauses that might as well have been written in Latin. Emma was in the living room, video chatting with Sarah Fletcher about the day's events, her excited chatter providing a soundtrack to Jake's confusion. The money would solve everything, not just the immediate crisis, but Emma's college fund, the ranch repairs, maybe even enough to buy back some of the cattle they'd had to sell. But something about signing a contract for Buster felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Pete Hutchinson's number. "Jake, you got a minute?" Pete's gravelly voice carried an urgency Jake rarely heard from his neighbor. "I just had a mighty strange conversation with a fella from Nashville. Said he was a talent agent or some such. He's seen your video and wants to talk about putting Buster in music videos." "Music videos?" Jake felt like the world was spinning faster than he could keep up with. "That's what I said. Apparently there's a whole industry around animal performers I never knew existed. This fella mentioned dollar amounts that made my head spin. Jake, I think you might be sitting on something bigger than any of us realized." Over the next few days, the phone calls became overwhelming. Reporters, talent agents, production companies, and marketing firms all wanted to discuss opportunities involving Buster. Jake found himself taking notes on conversations he barely understood, trying to evaluate offers for services he'd never imagined existed. Sarah Fletcher proved invaluable during this chaotic period, helping Jake research the various companies and individuals reaching out. Her teaching background had given her experience with contracts and negotiations that Jake lacked. "The Petco deal seems legitimate," she told him, over coffee at the kitchen table while Emma was at school. "I've looked up Margaret Chen. She's exactly who she claims to be, and Petco has a good reputation for animal welfare, but some of these other offers..." She shook her head. "There are people trying to take advantage of your situation." "How do I tell the difference?" Jake asked. 6 months ago, my biggest business decision was whether to buy generic or name brand feed. Now I'm supposed to understand marketing contracts and licensing deals? You don't have to understand everything," Sarah said gently. "You just have to protect Emma and Buster. Anyone who wants to work with you should be willing to meet your terms, not the other way around." That evening, Jake made his decision. He called Margaret Chen and accepted Petco's offer. With one modification, all filming would take place on the ranch, with Emma's school schedule taking priority over any commercial considerations. To his relief, Margaret agreed immediately. "We want this to feel authentic," she said. "Bringing Buster to a studio would change the whole dynamic. The ranch setting is part of what makes your story so compelling." The first check arrived by overnight delivery 3 days later, 25,000, made out to Jake Morrison. As he held the piece of paper that represented more money than he'd seen in years, Jake thought about all the bills he could pay, all the repairs he could make, all the security he could provide for Emma. But it was Emma's reaction that truly drove home the magnitude of what was happening. "Does this mean we get to keep the ranch, Daddy?" she asked, studying the check with wide eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "We get to keep the ranch." That night, as Jake tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with the serious expression that always reminded him of Sarah. "Mama would be proud of us, wouldn't she?" Emma asked. "For taking care of Buster and letting him help us too." Jake kissed her forehead, thinking about Sarah's belief that everything happened for a reason, that the universe had a way of providing what people needed when they needed it most. "She would be very proud," he whispered, "of all of us." In the barn, Buster stood quietly in his stall, his belly full of the best hay money could buy, his coat gleaming with health and care. The worn halter that had spoken of neglect and abandonment had been replaced with supple leather that fit perfectly, a symbol of how far they'd all come from that day at the auction. Outside, the Montana sky was brilliant with stars, the same stars that had watched over 3 generations of Morrisons on this land. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something extraordinary, rather than the end of something precious. The television studio in Denver felt like another planet compared to the familiar barns and pastures of the Morrison ranch. Jake stood beside Buster's travel crate in the green room, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning, while Emma chatted excitedly with the production assistants who'd been charmed by her immediately. "First time on television?" asked Tom Bradley, the host of Good Morning Colorado, as he stopped by to introduce himself. He was exactly what Jake had expected: perfect teeth, silver hair, and the kind of confident smile that came from years of practice. "First time anywhere like this," Jake admitted, adjusting his tie for the dozenth time. Sarah Fletcher had insisted he buy new clothes for the appearance, and everything felt stiff and foreign against his skin. "You'll do fine," Tom assured him. "Just be yourselves. That's what people fell in love with in the first place." The television studio guest badge clipped to Jake's shirt felt heavier than it should have, a tangible reminder of how far they'd traveled from their quiet ranch life. When Margaret Chen had suggested the national television appearance as part of Petco's marketing strategy, Jake's first instinct had been to decline, but Emma's enthusiasm had been impossible to resist. "Think of all the people who will get to meet Buster," she'd said. "Maybe some of them need hope too, just like we did." Now, watching Emma demonstrate Buster's musical abilities for the fascinated production crew, Jake marveled at how naturally she handled the attention. Where he felt awkward and out of place, she seemed to thrive, explaining Buster's story with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that the world needed to hear it. "He was very sad when we first met him," Emma told a camera operator who'd been filming behind-the-scenes footage. "But Daddy says, sometimes the best things come when you're not looking for them." Buster helped us remember how to be happy again. The wisdom in her words struck Jake like a physical blow. When had his 8-year-old daughter become so articulate about loss and healing? When had she learned to speak about their family's pain with such grace and insight? The actual television appearance passed in a blur of bright lights and carefully choreographed segments. Jake found himself telling their story to millions of viewers: the auction, the $20 bid, Emma's instant connection with Buster, the discovery of his musical talent. Emma and Buster performed their lullaby duet flawlessly, with Buster seeming to understand that this moment was important. His harmonies were pitch perfect, his timing impeccable, but it was during the interview portion that Jake found himself speaking from the heart in a way he hadn't expected. "You lost your wife 3 years ago," Tom said gently, his media training evident in how he handled the sensitive topic. "How has Buster helped you and Emma through that grief?" Jake looked at Emma, who was sitting beside him with Buster's lead rope in her small hands, and felt words he hadn't planned rising to the surface. "Sarah, my wife, she always believed that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to show up in your life. When Emma started singing with Buster, I heard my wife's voice again. Not literally, but the joy she brought to everything, the way she could find magic in ordinary moments. Buster gave that back to us." The studio was completely silent, except for the hum of cameras. Even Tom Bradley, veteran of thousands of interviews, seemed moved by the raw honesty in Jake's voice. "What would you say to other families who are struggling right now?" Tom asked. Emma spoke before Jake could answer. "Sometimes you have to take care of something else before you can take care of yourself. When we started helping Buster feel better, we started feeling better too." The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded during the live broadcast, with viewers sharing their own stories of loss and recovery. The show's hashtag Buster and Emma began trending nationally within hours. But perhaps the most profound moment came during a commercial break, when a woman in the studio audience approached them with tears in her eyes. "My daughter died in a car accident last year," she said quietly. "I've been angry at God, angry at the world, angry at everything. But watching you two with that donkey, seeing how you've turned your pain into something beautiful, it's the first time I've felt hope in months." Emma reached out and took the woman's hand with the instinctive compassion that continued to amaze Jake. "I'm sorry about your daughter," she said simply, "but I bet she's watching you from heaven, and I bet she wants you to be happy again." The flight home to Montana felt surreal. Jake stared out the airplane window at clouds that looked like cotton balls, processing everything that had happened. In less than a week, they'd gone from local curiosity to national sensation. The video that had started it all now had over 2 million views, and Emma's email, which Sarah Fletcher had helped her set up, was full of messages from around the world. "Daddy," Emma said, looking up from the tablet where she was reading viewer comments, "there's a message from someone in Japan who says Buster's singing helped her learn English. And look, this family in Texas got a donkey because of us." Jake smiled, though part of him still felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd unleashed. The simple act of sharing their joy had somehow created a ripple effect that reached far beyond anything he'd imagined possible. When they landed in Denver for their connecting flight, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. "Response to the show has been incredible. Petco stock is up 3% today. We're fast-tracking the commercial production. Can we start filming next week?" The drive home from the airport took them through the familiar landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains that had been the Morrison family home for 3 generations. As they crested the hill that revealed their ranch spread out below, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The barn roof had been repaired while they were gone. The fences were straight and strong, and the pastures looked ready to support cattle again. But it was the sight of Buster in his paddock, lifting his head at the sound of their truck, that really drove home how much their lives had changed. The scruffy, neglected animal from the auction had been transformed into a sleek, healthy donkey whose musical talent had captured the hearts of millions. That evening, as Emma insisted on giving Buster a detailed account of their television adventure, Jake stood in the barn doorway, watching the interaction that had started it all. The homemade Buster's stage sign still hung on the stall door, though it was now accompanied by professional lighting that Margaret's team had installed for the upcoming commercial shoot. "The lady on the airplane said we're inspirational," Emma told Buster seriously. "I think that means we help people remember that good things can still happen." Jake nodded, thinking about the woman in the studio audience, the messages from around the world, the stock prices rising because people believed in the power of their story. Emma was right. They had become something larger than themselves, a symbol of hope for people who needed reminding that miracles could still happen. But as he watched his daughter and their remarkable donkey preparing for another musical session, Jake realized that the real miracle wasn't the fame or the money or the national attention. The real miracle was the healing that had taken place in their own hearts, the way a $20 act of compassion had restored their faith in tomorrow. The television studio guest badge was tucked away in Jake's wallet now, a souvenir of how far they'd traveled from that dusty auction barn. But as Buster began his evening serenade and Emma's laughter filled the Montana air, Jake knew that no stage in the world could be more perfect than this moment, right here at home. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while Jake was repairing fence posts with materials he could finally afford to buy new instead of used. Dr. Amanda Foster identified herself as a researcher from the University of California's Animal Behavior Institute, and her tone carried the careful precision of someone accustomed to delivering information that could change everything. "Mr. Morrison," she began, "I've been studying your videos of Buster extensively. What I'm seeing suggests abilities that go far beyond typical animal responses to music. I'd like to request permission to conduct some genetic testing." Jake set down his post-hole digger, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Genetic testing? What kind of testing?" "Non-invasive," Dr. Foster assured him quickly. "Just a simple cheek swab. But Mr. Morrison, I have reason to believe Buster might be descended from a very special bloodline, one that could explain his remarkable musical abilities. 3 days later, Dr. Foster arrived at the ranch with a team of graduate students and enough equipment to stock a small laboratory. Emma was fascinated by the entire process, asking questions that impressed the researchers with their insight and genuine curiosity. "Why do you want to know about Buster's family?" Emma asked as Dr. Foster carefully collected DNA samples. "Because sometimes," the scientist explained, "talents run in families, just like they do with people. Your brown eyes came from your parents, right? Well, Buster's musical abilities might have come from his parents too." The testing process was thorough and professional. Dr. Foster's team recorded hours of Buster's performances, analyzed his vocal patterns, and conducted behavioral assessments that revealed the depth of his musical understanding. But it was the historical research they shared that truly amazed Jake. There have been documented cases of musically gifted donkeys throughout history, Dr. Foster explained as they sat around the kitchen table that evening. Most famously, a donkey named Maestro, who performed in vaudeville theaters across Europe in the 1920s. He was said to be able to harmonize with any melody, even improvise variations on familiar tunes. Emma's eyes were wide with wonder. Was Maestro famous? Very famous, Dr. Foster confirmed. He performed for royalty, appeared in early motion pictures, and was considered one of the most remarkable animal performers of his era. But here's the interesting part. Maestro disappeared during World War II. Many of his descendants were scattered across different continents, and the bloodline was thought to be lost. Jake felt a chill of premonition. "You think Buster might be related to this Maestro?" "It's possible," Dr. Foster said carefully. "We'll know for certain when the lab results come back in about a week." That week passed with agonizing slowness. Jake found himself watching Buster with new eyes, looking for signs of some hereditary greatness he'd never noticed before. Emma, meanwhile, was convinced that Buster was descended from donkey royalty, as she put it, and treated him with even more reverence than usual. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Emma was at school. Dr. Foster's voice was barely contained excitement as she delivered the results. "Jake, you need to sit down for this. Buster is a direct descendant of Maestro. Not just any descendant, he's what we would consider genetic royalty in the animal performance world. His DNA shows markers that we've only seen in theoretical models of what perfect musical genetics might look like." Jake sank into his kitchen chair, trying to process the implications. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means Buster isn't just talented, he's potentially the most genetically gifted musical animal alive today. And Jake, there's something else. I've been in contact with colleagues in Europe, and there's a family in Austria who's been searching for Maestro's bloodline for decades." The something else turned out to be Ernst Zimmermann, a man whose grandfather had been Maestro's original trainer and owner. Ernst had built a career around animal performance, developing training methods that were considered revolutionary in the entertainment industry. More importantly, he had documentation proving his family's legal claim to any of Maestro's direct descendants. "This is impossible," Jake said when Dr. Foster explained the situation over the phone. "Buster is ours. We bought him legally at a public auction." "I understand your position," Dr. Foster said gently, "but Ernst has documentation dating back to the 1940s, establishing his family's ownership rights to Maestro's bloodline. His lawyers are suggesting that Buster was essentially stolen property that's been passing through auction houses for decades without the sellers knowing his true value." Emma's reaction when Jake explained the situation was exactly what he'd feared. Complete devastation, mixed with fierce, protective anger. "They can't take Buster," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "He's our family. He belongs with us." Jake held her close, his own heart breaking at the thought of losing the donkey who'd saved them in so many ways. "We're going to fight this, Em. I promise you, we're going to do everything we can to keep Buster here where he belongs." But even as he made the promise, Jake knew they were facing an uphill battle. Ernst Zimmermann wasn't just any claimant, he was wealthy, connected, and had decades of experience in the animal entertainment industry. His lawyers had already filed preliminary injunctions that could freeze Buster's commercial activities pending the outcome of the ownership dispute. The media attention was immediate and intense. The story of a family potentially losing their beloved donkey to genetic inheritance laws captured public imagination in a way that surprised everyone involved. Save Buster became a trending hashtag, with supporters sharing stories about their own rescue animals and the bonds that transcended legal ownership. Margaret Chen from Petco called within hours of the story breaking. "Jake, we're behind you 100%. Petco has legal resources, and we're prepared to use them. This isn't just about Buster anymore, it's about the principle that love and care matter more than paperwork." Sarah Fletcher proved to be an unexpected source of strength during this crisis. She helped Jake research legal precedents, connected him with animal rights attorneys, and most importantly, provided Emma with the emotional support she needed to process what was happening. "Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be," Sarah told Emma as they sat in the barn with Buster. "But you know what? Buster gets to have a say in this too. Animals always choose where they want to be." Ernst Zimmermann arrived from Austria on a Friday, accompanied by an interpreter, 2 lawyers, and a documentary film crew that was apparently following his quest to reunite with Maestro's bloodline. He was a man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way, but his love for animal performance seemed genuine. "I mean no disrespect to your family," Ernst said through his interpreter as they stood outside Buster's paddock. "But you must understand this animal represents generations of careful breeding, decades of genetic development. He belongs in an environment where his gifts can be properly nurtured and showcased." Jake watched Buster's reaction to the stranger carefully. The donkey was alert but calm, showing none of the immediate recognition or excitement that Ernst seemed to be expecting. "With respect, Mr. Zimmerman," Jake replied, "Buster's gifts are being nurtured here. He's happy, healthy, and performing at a level that's captured the attention of the entire world. What more could you offer him?" "Professional training," Ernst said immediately. "Proper facilities, veterinary specialists, a career that could make him the most famous animal performer of the modern era. What you've accomplished is admirable, but it's amateur. I can make him legendary." That evening, as Jake tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and a determination that reminded him powerfully of Sarah. "Daddy," she whispered, "what if we let Buster choose? What if we prove that he wants to stay with us?" Jake kissed her forehead, marveling once again at his daughter's wisdom. "That's exactly what we're going to do, sweetheart. We're going to let Buster show everyone where he belongs." The DNA test results sat in a folder on Jake's dresser, official proof that their $20 donkey was worth potentially millions, that he was the genetic heir to a legacy of animal entertainment royalty. But as Jake listened to Emma's breathing settle into sleep and heard Buster's gentle movement in the barn below, he knew that no amount of genetic pedigree could measure the true value of what they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and judges and arguments about ownership and inheritance. But tonight, Buster was home, and that was worth fighting for with everything they had. The law office of Henderson, Martinez, Associates felt like foreign territory to Jake Morrison. The mahogany conference table was longer than his kitchen, and the leather chairs probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But David Martinez, the attorney Margaret Chen had recommended, spoke with a quiet confidence that gave Jake hope. "The good news," David said, spreading documents across the polished surface, "is that possession counts for a lot in cases like this. You've provided excellent care for Buster, you've documented his health improvements, and you have clear evidence that he's thriving in your environment." Emma sat beside Jake, her small hands folded in her lap with the serious demeanor she'd adopted since learning about the legal challenge. She'd insisted on being present for all discussions about Buster's future, displaying a maturity that continued to amaze the adults around her. "What's the bad news?" Jake asked, though he could read the answer in David's expression. Ernst Zimmerman's claim is legitimate. His family does have historical documentation establishing their ownership of Maestro, and by extension, any direct descendants. The question is whether those 19th-century contracts hold legal weight in a modern American court when weighed against the best interests of the animal. The preparation for the hearing consumed the next 2 weeks. David's team worked tirelessly to build their case, gathering expert testimony about animal welfare, documentation of Buster's care and improvement under Jake's ownership, and character references from everyone who'd witnessed the transformation of both the donkey and the Morrison family. Dr. Amanda Foster proved to be a crucial ally. Her research had expanded beyond genetics to include behavioral analysis that strongly supported Buster's emotional attachment to Emma and Jake. Animals form complex social bonds, she explained during a practice session for Jake's testimony. Buster exhibits clear signs of attachment to your family unit. Separating him now could cause significant psychological trauma, regardless of his genetic heritage. The community support was overwhelming. Pete Hutchinson organized a petition that gathered over 50 signatures from people around the world who wanted Buster to remain with the Morrison family. Sarah Fletcher helped coordinate media interviews that kept public attention focused on the human side of the story rather than just the legal technicalities. But it was the support from other animal rescue organizations that truly strengthened their case. Representatives from sanctuaries, rescue operations, and animal welfare groups testified about the importance of stable, loving environments over commercial or performance considerations. This case sets a precedent, explained Maria Santos from the National Animal Rescue Alliance. If genetic heritage can override the welfare of properly cared-for animals, it puts thousands of rescue animals at risk. Buster isn't just a donkey anymore. He's a symbol of whether love and care matter more than paperwork and profit. Ernst Zimmerman's preparation was equally thorough but focused on different arguments. His legal team emphasized Buster's extraordinary value, both monetary and cultural, arguing that such a rare genetic specimen belonged in professional hands where his abilities could be properly developed and preserved for future generations. This is not merely about one animal, Ernst's lead attorney argued during a preliminary hearing. This is about preserving a genetic legacy that represents decades of careful breeding and cultural heritage. Mr. Morrison means well, but he lacks the expertise to properly steward such a valuable living treasure. The media attention intensified as the hearing date approached. News crews camped outside the ranch, documenting every aspect of Jake and Emma's daily routine with Buster. Emma handled the attention with remarkable poise, though Jake could see the stress taking its toll on her sleep and appetite. "What if they take him away, Daddy?" she asked one evening as they sat in the barn, watching Buster contentedly munch his dinner hay. "Then we'll know we did everything we could to fight for him," Jake replied, though his own fears echoed hers. "Sometimes doing the right thing means fighting, even when you're not sure you can win." Buster seemed to sense the tension surrounding him. His performances during this period were particularly moving, as if he understood that his future hung in the balance. The bond between him and Emma appeared to deepen, with the donkey showing protective behaviors that hadn't been present before. Sarah Fletcher spent increasing amounts of time at the ranch during this period, providing both practical support and emotional stability for Emma. Jake found himself grateful for her presence in ways that went beyond their current crisis. She'd become part of their extended family, without anyone officially acknowledging the transition. "You know," Sarah said one evening as they watched Emma practice with Buster, "regardless of how the hearing goes, you've already won something important." "What's that?" Jake asked. "You've shown Emma that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how overwhelming the odds seem. That's a lesson that will serve her well for the rest of her life." The night before the hearing, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked out to the barn around midnight, finding Buster alert and waiting as if he, too, understood the importance of the coming day. Jake spent an hour sitting in the stall, talking to the donkey about everything that had happened since that $20 bid at the auction. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," he told Buster quietly, "but I want you to know that whatever happens, these months with you have been a gift. You gave us back our faith in good things happening. You helped Emma remember how to laugh. You probably saved this ranch and definitely saved us." Buster moved closer, resting his head against Jake's shoulder in a gesture of affection that had become familiar over their months together. For a moment, sitting in the quiet barn with Montana stars visible through the open door, Jake could almost forget about courtrooms and lawyers and competing claims. This was just a man and a donkey who'd found each other when they both needed hope. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the fence posts like tiny diamonds. Emma, dressed in her best outfit, a blue dress Sarah had helped her pick out, with a small pin shaped like a musical note that Margaret Chen had sent as a good luck charm. "Remember," David Martinez told them as they gathered outside the courthouse, "this isn't just about legal arguments. Judge Patricia Hawkins has a reputation for considering the human element in her decisions. She'll want to see the real relationship between you and Buster, not just the paperwork." Ernst Zimmerman arrived with his full legal team and the documentary crew that had been following his quest. He nodded politely to Jake and Emma, but maintained the distant air of someone confident in the righteousness of his cause. "Mr. Zimmerman," Emma said, approaching him with the directness that only children possess, "do you really think Buster would be happier with you than with us?" Ernst looked surprised by the question. Through his interpreter, he replied, "I think Buster deserves the opportunity to reach his full potential, young lady. That requires resources and expertise that perhaps your family cannot provide. But he's already reaching his potential." Emma replied seriously, "He's making people all over the world happy. He's helping families like ours. Remember that good things can still happen. Isn't that what potential means?" Jake watched Ernst's expression shift slightly, as if Emma's question had touched on something he hadn't fully considered. But before he could respond, David Martinez called them to gather. It was time to enter the courtroom, where Buster's fate would be decided. The legal documents that would determine Buster's future were neatly organized in folders on both attorneys' tables. Contracts, genetic test results, witness statements, and expert testimony, all the paper trail that modern justice required to make sense of love and loyalty, and the bonds that transcended ownership. As they took their seats in the gallery, Jake felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The $20 bid, the first video upload, the television appearance, the DNA testing, each choice had seemed small at the time. But together they'd created a chain of events that now required a judge to determine the difference between legal ownership and rightful belonging. Emma reached over and took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. In that gesture, Jake found the strength he needed for whatever came next. They'd faced loss before, survived grief that seemed impossible to bear, and somehow found their way to hope again. Whatever Judge Hawkins decided, they would face it together, as a family. The bailiff called the court to order, and Jake Morrison prepared to fight for a donkey who'd already given them so much more than they'd ever expected when they'd brought him home from that dusty auction barn 6 months ago. Judge Patricia Hawkins possessed the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades weighing complex human situations. As she settled behind the bench, her gavel represented more than judicial authority. It held the power to determine whether love or law would prevail in Buster's case. "This is an unusual matter," Judge Hawkins began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "We're here to determine the rightful ownership of a donkey named Buster, based on competing claims of genetic heritage versus current care and custody. I want both parties to understand that my primary concern is the welfare of the animal in question." Ernst Zimmerman's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Harrison Webb, opened with a presentation that was both impressive and intimidating. He displayed historical documents dating back to the 1920s, genetic test results that proved Buster's lineage beyond doubt, and expert testimony about the rarity and value of Maestro's bloodline. Your Honor, Webb argued, this case is fundamentally about preserving cultural heritage and ensuring that irreplaceable genetic material receives proper stewardship. Mr. Zimmerman's family has maintained legal claim to Maestro's descendants for nearly a century. The fact that this particular animal ended up in a livestock auction represents a failure of the system, not a legitimate transfer of ownership. Webb's presentation included video footage of Ernst's facilities in Austria, state-of-the-art barns, professional training equipment, and veterinary facilities that made Jake's ranch look primitive by comparison. Expert witnesses testified about Buster's potential value in the entertainment industry, with estimates reaching into the millions of dollars. Furthermore, Webb continued, while Mr. Morrison's intentions are admirable, his amateur approach to animal training risks damaging Buster's natural abilities. This donkey represents a genetic treasure that belongs in professional hands, not serving as a therapy animal for one family's emotional needs. The words stung, but Jake forced himself to remain calm. David Martinez had prepared him for these arguments, explaining that Ernst's team would try to paint them as well-meaning but inadequate guardians of something too valuable for ordinary people to properly appreciate. Dr. Ernst Zimmerman himself took the stand next, speaking through his interpreter with passion about his lifelong dedication to preserving his grandfather's legacy. His love for animal performance was genuine, and his knowledge impressive. He described plans for Buster that included world tours, television specials, and breeding programs designed to ensure that Maestro's genetic line would continue for future generations. "This animal represents my family's heritage," Ernst testified, his emotion clear even through translation. "My grandfather spent his life developing Maestro's abilities, and when the war scattered his descendants, we lost something precious. Finding Buster is like recovering a piece of our family's soul." Judge Hawkins listened carefully, asking probing questions about the historical documents and the practical implications of Ernst's claims. Her expressions remained neutral, but Jake noticed that she paid particular attention to questions about Buster's current condition and behavior. When Ernst's team called for expert testimony about professional animal training, Jake felt his confidence wavering. The witnesses were impressive, renowned animal behaviorists, entertainment industry professionals, and genetic specialists who spoke about Buster's potential in terms that made Jake's simple ranch life seem inadequate. "Animals of this caliber require specialized care," testified Dr. Robert Chen, a veterinary behaviorist from Los Angeles. "While Mr. Morrison has provided adequate basic care, he lacks the resources and expertise to fully develop Buster's extraordinary abilities. This donkey could be performing for millions of people worldwide instead of being confined to amateur family entertainment." David Martinez's cross-examination was thorough, focusing on the witness's lack of first-hand knowledge about Buster's actual condition and behavior. He challenged their assumptions about what constituted proper care, pointing out that none of them had actually spent time observing Buster in his current environment. "Dr. Chen," David asked, "have you personally examined Buster or observed his interactions with the Morrison family?" "No, but the video evidence clearly shows. So your opinions about his welfare are based entirely on watching internet videos, not on professional examination of the animal in question. The videos provide sufficient evidence of the animal's basic condition." "Yes." Judge Hawkins called for a brief recess, during which Jake found himself questioning everything they'd built their case around. Ernst's resources were impressive, his legal claim seemed solid, and his experts made compelling arguments about professional care versus family attachment. Emma sat beside him in the courthouse hallway, unusually quiet as she processed everything she'd heard. Finally, she looked up at Jake with the serious expression that always reminded him of Sarah. "Daddy," she whispered, "they keep talking about what Buster could do, but they don't ask what Buster wants to do. Her words crystallized something Jake had been feeling throughout the morning's testimony. All of Ernst's arguments focused on potential and value and professional development, but none of them addressed the simple question of where Buster would be happiest. When court reconvened, it would be their turn to present their case. Jake hoped that love and loyalty would prove more persuasive than legal documents and professional expertise. But sitting in that hallway, he realized that the gavel in Judge Hawkins's hands held the power to separate their family in ways that would leave scars lasting far longer than any legal proceedings. When court reconvened, David Martinez opened their defense with a strategy that surprised everyone, including Jake. Instead of challenging Ernst's legal claims or questioning the historical documents, he focused entirely on a single question: what was truly in Buster's best interest? Your Honor, David began, opposing counsel has presented impressive evidence about genetic heritage and commercial potential. But they've overlooked the most important factor in this case, the welfare and happiness of the animal we're discussing. I'd like to call Emma Morrison to the stand. Jake's heart clenched as his 8-year-old daughter walked to the witness chair with the quiet dignity that continued to amaze everyone who met her. She looked tiny in the formal setting, but her voice was clear and steady as she swore to tell the truth. Emma, David said gently, can you tell the court how you met Buster? Daddy bought him at an auction for $20, Emma replied. Nobody else wanted him because he was skinny and sad. But I could see that he was special. What made him special? Emma's face brightened. He listened. When I hummed Mama's lullaby, My Mama Died When I Was 5, Buster started singing along. Not like he was copying me, but like he really understood the music. David led Emma through her testimony with careful attention to her age and emotional state. She described Buster's transformation from a neglected animal to a healthy, happy donkey who seemed to thrive on their daily musical sessions. She talked about the joy he brought to their lives and the way his happiness seemed to grow alongside their own. Emma, David asked, the people who want to take Buster say they can give him better training and more opportunities. What do you think about that? Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think Buster is already doing what he's supposed to do. He makes people happy. He helps families remember that good things can happen. If you take him away from people who love him just to make him more famous, that's not helping him, that's hurting him. When Harrison Webb cross-examined Emma, his questions were gentle but pointed. He asked about her family's financial struggles, their lack of professional animal training experience, and their inability to provide the kind of resources Ernst could offer. Emma, Webb said, don't you want Buster to have the best possible life? The finest veterinary care, professional training, opportunities to perform for millions of people? Emma looked at Webb with the directness that only children possess. Buster already has the best possible life. He has people who love him just for who he is, not for how much money he can make. Isn't that what everyone wants? The courtroom was completely silent. Webb looked uncertain about how to respond to such simple honesty. Judge Hawkins asked her own questions, focusing on Emma's understanding of the situation and her relationship with Buster. It was clear that the judge was impressed by Emma's maturity and the genuine love she expressed for the donkey. When Emma stepped down, David called Jake to the stand. Jake's testimony was more technical, focusing on the care they'd provided, the improvements in Buster's health, and the documentation of his remarkable musical abilities. But it was when David asked about the impact Buster had made on their family that Jake's voice became thick with emotion. Buster didn't just come to live with us, Jake said. He became part of our healing. After my wife died, Emma and I were lost. We were going through the motions of living, but we weren't really alive. Buster changed that. He gave us something to care about besides our grief. He showed us that joy was still possible. The final phase of their case was the most dramatic. Judge Hawkins had agreed to an unusual request. She wanted to observe Buster's behavior with both families to help inform her decision. The courthouse steps became an impromptu performance space as Buster was led from the transport trailer that had brought him from the ranch. Ernst approached first, armed with professional equipment and treats designed to establish rapport with performing animals. Buster was polite but distant with Ernst. He accepted the treats, allowed himself to be handled, and even responded to some basic training cues. But there was no spark, no connection, no sign of the musical enthusiasm that had made him famous. Then Emma approached. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. Buster's ears perked forward, his entire posture changed, and he moved toward Emma with obvious joy. When she began humming their familiar lullaby, his response was the most beautiful performance Jake had ever heard. Rich, melodic, perfectly timed, and filled with genuine emotion. But it was what happened next that decided the case. Without any prompting from Emma, Buster began his own melody, a new song Jake had never heard before, but one that seemed to express everything the donkey felt about his life with their family. Emma joined in, their voices blending in perfect harmony, while tears streamed down the faces of everyone watching. When the song ended, Buster stepped closer to Emma and rested his head against her shoulder in a gesture of such obvious love and trust that even Ernst Zimmerman's expression softened. Judge Hawkins observed this interaction in complete silence, her gavel resting on the bench as she watched the final performance that would determine Buster's fate. 6 months after Judge Patricia Hawkins delivered her ruling, a decision that favored the Morrison family based on the clear and demonstrable bond between the animal and his current caregivers, which serves the best interests of all parties involved. The Morrison ranch had been transformed in ways that still amazed Jake every morning when he stepped outside. The new sign at the end of their driveway read, "Morrison Family Ranch, Home of Buster," in elegant lettering that caught the morning sun. It had been Emma's idea, a way to honor both their family legacy and the donkey who had saved it. The sign represented everything they had become: a working ranch, a loving home, and the birthplace of a story that continued to inspire people around the world. The ranch itself bore little resemblance to the struggling operation Jake had feared losing just a year ago. The barn roof was not only repaired but expanded, with professional lighting and sound equipment for Buster's performances. The fences were straight and strong, the pastures green and ready to support the small herd of cattle Jake had been able to buy back. Most importantly, the rescue operation Emma had dreamed of was now a reality. Morrison Family Animal Rescue occupied the renovated back paddocks, currently home to 3 horses, 2 donkeys, a handful of goats, and various smaller animals that had found their way to the ranch through word of mouth and social media. Emma, now 9 and wise beyond her years, had thrown herself into the rescue work with the same passion she'd brought to her relationship with Buster. "Every animal deserves a second chance," she often said, echoing words her mother might have spoken. "Just like Buster gave us." So, the rescue operation was funded partly by ongoing royalties from Buster's commercial work, which continued on their terms, with all filming done on the ranch and Emma's schedule taking priority over any business considerations. But the larger portion came from donations inspired by their story, contributions from people who wanted to support the kind of second chances that had transformed the Morrison family. Jake stood at the kitchen window, watching Emma lead a group of visitors on a tour of the rescue facilities. She'd become an accomplished tour guide, sharing the stories of each animal with the confidence of someone who understood that every creature had value beyond what others might see on the surface. "She's a natural teacher," Sarah Fletcher, now Sarah Morrison, as of 3 months ago, observed as she joined Jake at the window. Their quiet wedding had been a small affair, with Buster serving as an honorary groomsman and Emma as both flower girl and the person who'd pushed them together with the determination of a child who recognized love when she saw it. "She gets that from you," Jake replied, slipping his arm around his wife's waist, "and from her mother, both of them." Sarah leaned into his embrace, and together they watched their daughter explain to a group of wide-eyed children how rescue animals often turned out to be the most loyal and loving companions. Emma's audience included several families who were considering adoptions, drawn to the ranch by Buster's fame, but staying for the deeper message about the value of giving forgotten animals new homes. Buster himself was in his element, performing for the visitors with the enthusiasm that had made him an internet sensation. But his most treasured performances remained the private concerts he gave Emma each evening, their voices blending in the barn while the Montana sky filled with stars. The legal victory had brought unexpected benefits beyond simply keeping Buster with his chosen family. Ernst Zimmerman, rather than appealing the decision, had chosen to establish a partnership with the Morrison ranch. His expertise in animal genetics and training, combined with their natural approach to care and bonding, had created a model for ethical animal performance that was gaining recognition throughout the industry. "The child was right," Ernst had said through his interpreter after the trial. "Animals choose where they belong. My grandfather would have understood that better than I did." The partnership allowed Buster to contribute to genetic research that might help other animals, while ensuring he remained in the environment where he flourished. Ernst visited twice a year, sharing knowledge and helping document Buster's continued development as both performer and patriarch of what might become a new generation of musically gifted donkeys. The college fund that had seemed impossible during their darkest financial days was now fully funded, with enough left over for Emma to pursue whatever dreams captured her imagination as she grew older. She talked sometimes about becoming a veterinarian, sometimes about starting her own rescue organization, and sometimes about traveling the world to help other families find their own versions of hope. "Whatever she chooses," Jake often told Sarah, "she'll know that miracles are possible because she lived through one." The evening ritual remained unchanged, despite all the transformations in their lives. Emma would finish her homework at the kitchen table, help with dinner preparations, and then make her way to the barn for quality time with Buster. Jake and Sarah would often follow, creating an extended family gathering that included not just the donkey who'd started it all, but whatever rescue animals were currently calling the ranch home. Tonight, as Emma settled onto her familiar bucket and began the lullaby that had changed their lives, Buster responded with a melody that seemed richer and more complex than ever. But it was the addition of other voices, rescue horses nickering softly, goats making their own musical contributions, even the barn cats purring in harmony, that reminded Jake how far they'd all come from that dusty auction barn. As the impromptu concert filled the Montana air, Jake thought about the $20 bill he'd carried to the auction that day, expecting to come home with maybe a used tool or some fence wire. Instead, he'd bought hope, healing, and a future none of them could have imagined. The donkey, who'd had no bidders except a desperate father, had become the foundation for a life filled with purpose, love, and the daily miracle of second chances. Emma was right. As she so often was sometimes, the best things really did come disguised as burdens nobody else wanted. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those things turned out to be exactly what you needed to remember that tomorrow was always worth looking forward to.